Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Silmarillion Film Project. This is session number 4 of Season 7. And tonight, we are going to figure out the frame story. So, of course, the tradition has been that we have had a frame story ever since Season 1, when we had the Ainulindale and the story of the beginning of Arda. Happening within the frame of Elrond teaching young Estelle. How old was he at the time? Like 7, 8, 10? He was 10 at the time.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Of course he was 10 because we had Bilbo come in at the end. I forgot about the Bilbo cameo there.
And the middle.
Right. Yes. So, anyway, yeah. So that was, so we've been, it's been a decision we made a long time ago, and we've been following through, and it's been really fun to sort of have this sort of ongoing point of contact between the story of the First Age as it has unfolded and the story of the Third Age, because the frame has been proceeding chronologically, essentially, from then as well. And so we're kind of marching at these different paces from the from the years prior to the War of the Ring, up through that time towards the War of the Ring, while we've been going through the First Age. So, this is going to be a fun discussion because we have, I won't say we have no ideas, but we have no plan in place. We had, like last time we had a plan. We just had some decisions to make about how we were going to execute that plan. This season we have no set plan coming in, so we're kind of coming from scratch at this. Before we get too much further in, though, quick announcements. We have our busy moot season still coming up here, including this very week. In 2 days, I'm gonna be in Denver, Colorado for Mountain Moot. So Mountain Moot is going to be our second annual Mountain Moot up in Denver. Looking forward to seeing folks there again. Still time to join. had somebody sign up to come in person just earlier today, so there's still time to come and join us. And then we have our next moot is Bayou Moot down in New Orleans, Nolens, Louisiana. We're looking forward to. We've never been there before for a moot, so that's a brand new area for us. And then, of course, we're going to turn over the calendar into 2024 with Osmoot down in Sydney, Australia. Osmoot was so much fun last year. Can't wait to get back this year. And then Sunshine Moot in February. And we have a bunch more that are heading, that are coming through. And we'll be hitting the Moot pipeline before long. We've got SoCal Moot now confirmed. We've got a bunch of things coming. Potomac Moot in your area, guys. We're gonna be down in the DC area for a regional moot again. We haven't done that in many years, but anyway, gonna be great. Fun. Lots of others too. We're going to be doing. We're going to go in the UK. We're going to be going back to Texas, of course. I think Houston again this year is what looks like is shaping up for Tex Moot this year. Back up to Canada. So lots of fun here in the first half of 2024 as well. All right. Okay, so I think. It looks, Marie, like your new goal is to try for new records of what percentage of the broadcast you can get me talking about the map. It seems to be what's happening here.
Well, this is also narrowing the possibilities for frame stories to, the known world.
Yes.
It was one of the most comprehensive maps that is appropriate for the Third Age that I could find.
It's pretty nice.
It's based on the one that is annotated by Pauline Baynes and Tolkien,
Yes.
but obviously this is not the one with their handwriting on it.
Right.
I couldn't find a good scan of that one, so
yeah,
this is probably more legible.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, yes. You can see the little place because the green, of course, represents Tolkien's notes, so you can see his correction of the spelling of Enedwaith and various other things that he has added or corrected along the way. Sorry. I just I'm looking at this like his note about the rivers in Gondor. It's like, yeah, man, don't mess with Tolkien about the rivers in Gondor. Anyway, all right, so we make I'm not going to get drawn into a 45-minute discussion of the map, tempting though that is. So here's the frame stories so far. So as I mentioned, we started with 10-year-old Estelle, and I mentioned, the instructional context between Elrond and Estelle, but of course Gilrain was really the kind of heart of that one, and the sort of tension between Gilrain and
breakout
Elrond.
Star.
Yeah, Gilrain was the breakout star of the frame of season 1. We shifted to Arwen. We know, of course, before she returns to Rivendell and meets Aragorn, she was in Lothlorien with Galadriel and Celeborn. Season 2, of course, being the one about the awakening of the elves and their journey to Valinor. We had Arwen contemplating the question of what, first of all, what is the purpose of the elves? Which, of course, the elves themselves were trying to sort out back in the first stage and largely coming to the wrong decision. And, of course, this sort of led us to the question of what does it mean for Arwen to be the even star? What is sort of the point of that? So there was a lot of thinking and kind of development of the concept of Arwen's character on her own part.
Very subtle conversations, very small movements in the mode of thinking.
Very elvish frame, that one was. Yes. In that way.
It's definitely the most elvish frame. There's
definitely
no
the
question.
Most elvish frame, for sure.
And which, considering it's the origin story of the elves that we're telling in that season, that is relatively appropriate.
Yep.
For elvish audiences.
Seems just right. Yeah, the Elvish audiences really got into that. Okay, so that season 3, which of course was the one that was covering.
We overcompensated for the Elvish frame.
Exactly, by the very, very human frame of season 3, and of course so this was this was teenage Estelle, what, like 16-ish, right?
Yeah, in that neighborhood. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is teenage Estelle kind of feeling himself, having adventures with the Dunedain, befriending, making a friend named Hamilcar, who dies, and Eladon and Elro here chasing him around and trying to fix things and stuff. And of course, the interesting parallel here was, of course, season 3 is the big Feanor season, right? It starts with the burning of the ships, right, and ended essentially at the death of Feanor, a little bit after. Starts a little before that, ends a little after that, but it was basically the primary troubles. Probably
the rebellion of the Noldor is the first half of the season. Yeah,
exactly.
With some meanwhile in Beleriand.
Yes, with some meanwhile in Beleriand. Right, that's when we did the battle with the orcs and the death of Denethor and the green elves getting slaughtered and all that stuff. Yeah.
Yes.
Anyway, and spiders and the girdle, right? All that stuff that's all season 3.
Yes.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
There as well. Good old Norn, our original dwarf. So the kind of the parallel that we were doing there in the frame of season 3 was paralleling Aragorn and Feanor, basically, sort of showing the kind of potentials there and the choices that were being made. So that I thought was sort of interesting.
Yes, so, considering how we had paralleled them to Melkor in season 1, like poor little Estelle.
Right. Not that we're trying to be menacing about the future of Aragorn, but
I'll tell you that I can see the comparison between a small child and Melkor more now than I could then, for sure.
Yeah.
You've had more firsthand experience with small children in the interim.
a little bit.
Exactly.
A little bit.
Exactly. Okay, season 4. Now, season 4 was of Beleriand and its realms, right? So this was one of the primary threads was the discovery of the truth of the kinslaying coming out in Thingol, banning, the ban of Thingol and stuff. And it ended with Glaurung coming out of hiding, briefly. And so here we did our dwarf frame. We had Balin,
our Erebor
Gandalf,
frame, yeah.
Yeah, Balin, Gandalf, and Bilbo returning to Erebor for the anniversary of the death of Smaug. We know that Bilbo did go to the Lonely Mountain at one other time and saw everything, and so we did a frame in that moment when Bilbo returns back to Erebor. And I'm the thing we were doing there, as I recall, because of course it was all about sort of suspicion and trust and betrayal of trust and overcoming betrayal of trust,
yeah.
And within the main story. And so we were looking at that with the
people
with the
who
dwarves.
should be friends, not quite making it work and finding ways to get past them. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So there was a lot of stuff with the Men of Dale and the Wood Elves and the dwarves, like, which was fun because, of course, there's this sense at the end of The Hobbit, right? The Hobbit, being like a fairy tale, ends pleasantly, in a very kind of, and they all lived happily ever after, except the Master of Lake Town kind of way, right? We're not really told many details about what the next decade, looked like in the greater Erebor region. We're just, we're asked to believe after the Battle of Five Armies that things were okay, right, between the humans. The humans and elves and dwarves all patched it up after the battle, and things are merry and happy now by Gandalf's report, right? Again, apart from the unfortunate happenings with the Master of Lake Town. So anyway, so we were kind of returning to that and really thinking through what does that look like, and that was fun. Mm-hmm. Season 5. Okay, not gonna lie, season 5 was my favorite frame of all the frames that we've done.
I was gonna ask you to rank these, and
I don't know if I could rank them. That's too hard because then I gotta say like which one was my least favorite.
I can give you my top 3 for sure. That's relatively easy. But this is also my number 1.
Frame is my number 1 for sure. And so again, season 5 was when humans arrive in Beleriand, right? So from Beor's arrival and befriending by Finrod, all the way up through the Dagor Bragollach, and including the whole Athrobeth story with Andreth and Aignor being a major feature of that season as well. And the frame was Gandalf going to Harad as the return of Sauron impacts the area. So one of the primary things we were kind of investigating in that frame story was, what does it look like as Sauron is just beginning to return to power, as Sauron is beginning to reestablish his ancient power base in Rhûn and Harad? What does that look like on the ground? What does that look like within the context of the Haradrim cultures, which on the one hand do have an ancient affiliation with Sauron, but that was very ancient. It was a long time ago, right? And how would Sauron go about restoring that? And what would that do to the people? And how would that happen? So we know that Gandalf went to the south, as in Kanos, right? So we told this story of we invented this the Hobbiton of Harad, right? The place where Gandalf occasionally goes and is recognized and welcomed, like, or sort of mostly welcomed, like he is sort of mostly welcomed in Hobbiton, at least prior to the Bilbo's party fiasco, so that story of the incursions being made by the cult of Sauron in our little Haradrim town was the key there, including a fun Boromir and Faramir parallel, and then ultimately having one of the Haradrim folks, the returning with Gandalf to Gondor at the end of that frame. So we obviously have to return to him in a future frame,
for
clearly. in a Gondorian context, at the very least in a Thorongil context, I would think.
Yes.
And then, of course, last season, season 6, which was the Beren and Luthien season, we did Arwen and Aragorn. This was the one that we like knew about from furthest
Beginning.
away, right? Like from season 1, we were like, obviously, let's do, Aragorn sees Arwen and calls her to Nuviel. That story as the frame of the Beren and Luthien story, to bring those two stories into close contact together there. So that's what we did last season. So as we can see, our general trend has been, well, it's been various. Sometimes we're doing deliberately paralleled stories, right? Sometimes we're kind of touching on similar themes, as for instance what we were just talking about with season 4, with Bilbo returning to the Lonely Mountain and looking at, exploring the sort of intercultural tensions, Nick, as you said, of the difficulties of peoples who should be friends but have previously betrayed each other and whatnot. That, of course, being a direct concern of the season itself, and so we were kind of playing out similar themes in the two different contexts. Sometimes we've done the one-to-one parallel characters, like we were doing with Aragorn and Feanor in season 3, and of course with Aragorn and Arwen and Beren and Luthien to some extent, right? Playing those off each other in season 6. Sometime we had, of course, season 2 was was basically kind of a direct contemplation of the theme of the season from a third age context, right? As we were, unfolding it in a second age context as well. I think interestingly, Nick, our favorite frame is also the one that is least directly connected, I think, to the actual season itself, which is kind of interesting. I mean, it's not unconnected, but the connections are certainly less direct. It's harder to say in like 2 sentences exactly how that frame connected to the season itself, because the seasons. Well, the theme of season 5, if I'm recalling correctly, was change, right? That was the one that was about change. That was about, because it was with the mortals coming in and this perception of the pace of events accelerating, and the elves having to come to grips with the fact that the world is changing, and Fingolfin realizing maybe he should actually pay attention to the fact that he has and needs an heir, and of course ending with his the season ending with his death. So there was a connection there, in the sense that change was coming to, with the return of Sauron, change is coming back to Harad, right? But it was of a, there were still pretty wide differences. Again, you think about the closeness of how the Arwen frame in season 2 considers the central theme, which was Elven home, right? Where do elves belong, of the primary season. And season 5 is worlds away from that, from that kind of place of really kind of directly engaging with that stuff.
Yeah, as a story arc, it's the full story arc, I would say, it is not very closely tied. Now, we were able to tie the individual episode themes into the frame pretty well, but yes,
we made excuses for Gandalf to make the parallels for us.
Yes.
So he would be telling them a story of the First Age just for the fun of it.
Right.
Well, it was a return kind of to the. It was, I would say that the season 5 frame did the best job of combining what was really great about the season 1 frame, with kind of with the season 3 frame, the practical lesson learning of the season 3 frame. which I think um, it was one of the reasons why it was so easy for us to tie the individual episodes in as well as we were.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whereas when we have a clear and protracted story in the season frame, it's more difficult
Yes.
to tie that into the individual episodes.
Right.
For example, season 6 was kind of like that. It was kind of difficult at times to make the frame fit on an episode level
Yes.
um, with the main story, whereas the frame itself fits the
Yeah.
season
Big picture. Yeah.
arc.
It's
Yeah,
great. Yeah.
it writes itself, right? Sort of, until you start getting into the individual episodes.
Exactly. Because then
Until you try to actually write
until
it.
you actually try to write it. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Whereas we found it very easy in season 5.
Right.
Season 4 was another one that was kind of like that, because even though now, of course, the theming fit better overall, but because we didn't have a protracted story to tell, we were able to make it what we wanted it to be,
Mm-hmm.
And tell that frame story very, very easily, and make it slot right into the individual episodes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I mean, I would say that the season 4 frame might be the most successful, I think, in general.
Hmm.
Whereas the season 1 frame is probably the most true to being a frame.
Right.
Right? It's the most framey of the frame stories. Yeah.
Right. We've definitely had this ongoing challenge of trying to hit the right spot with what we're doing with the frame, because there's plenty of TV shows that use a framing device. So it's not an unusual thing we're trying to accomplish here. But sometimes that frame is very static. It's like there is a storyteller who is telling the story, and you pop back to them every once in a while. And you can make that dramatic or have tension to it, but it's still a storyteller frame.
Yes.
And we've done storyteller frames as individual episodes, but we've shied away from making our frame. There is this one guy who is telling this whole story, and we're going to just pop in and visit him every episode and see what he's doing. So since we're not doing a strict storyteller frame, it's then the question is, what are we doing? And we're telling an original story, but we're trying to tie it in thematically, and we're trying to make parallels within the episode. So it's hit on different points of how active the frame is and how much of an original story we're telling with it. Obviously, the season 4 frame was almost entirely made up of characters from The Hobbit.
Yeah.
Whereas the season 5 frame was almost entirely made up of original characters, with the exception of Gandalf.
Yeah.
And even he's running around as Incarnus. So it's not his typical role. So yeah, it was just we haven't quite managed to hit one arc of like, this is what we're doing with the frame in film. It's more of a, this is what we're doing with the frame this season.
Yes, exactly.
Although if I had to pick a thing to do consistently, the somewhere between the season 4 and the season 1 frame, I think is probably the sweet spot. I think, like I say, I think that season 4 was the most effective at supporting the main story.
Right.
Season 1 was more consistently a frame, and it wasn't obtrusive into the main narrative in the same way that a lot of the other ones could have been. And season 5 is obviously a lot of fun. I think it is probably let's say the third most effective. I would say.
It has the same shortcoming that season 3 frame has, which is
Yes.
we were trying to tell a lot of
Too
story
much
Yes.
happens. Yeah.
in the frame. Yeah, so we
Yeah.
have a whole independent plot that we need
Yes.
to work with.
Introducing whole sets of new characters and whole
Yeah.
world building and background and everything.
Which
Oh,
was a
to be
lot
f-
of fun and we had a great
Yeah.
time with it. But
Yes.
at the end of the day,
I think that
is it still a frame or is it your fourth plot line?
Right.
I would
Right.
I would say that the season 5 frame was still pretty effective. It was
I agree.
pretty
I
solidly
think that
effective.
yeah, we did pretty well with it. But yes, I agree that it has been hard when this and this I think of season 3 as the biggest example of this, when we're trying to do too much story in
Because
the frame.
we planned way more story for season 3 than ever made it into that
Oh,
frame.
yeah.
Like we had planned what could have been a whole season.
A whole season, right?
Yeah, like,
Yeah.
well, a half a season, 6
Right.
episodes. We had planned 6 episodes worth of material for the season 3
Yeah.
frame, and then you sit down to do it, and you're like, oh wait, we only have space for one episode here.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas season 2 had the opposite problem, where we
Mhm.
just had we had decided, okay, so this frame is going to be about Arwen figuring out what even
Right.
are the elves,
Right.
right? And we had the benefits of having Celeborn and Galadriel right there, and
Yeah.
they can help us with that because they were there.
Right.
And
But
that's
very
great.
little happened within the
Yes.
season 2 frame. We had several events and several flashback type of things to bring meaning to things, but basically it was Arwen sits around and talks to people and
Yeah.
has feelings,
Yeah.
which is fine, especially for a framing device.
Yeah.
But tracking the plot of that frame is tricky because
Right.
so very little
Yes.
is happening.
And
Yes.
as much as I enjoyed season 6 itself, I found the frame was probably the most disappointing thing about season 6.
Yeah.
Because I especially found it very, very difficult to kind of shoehorn that story into the Baron and Luthien story, because they resolve very differently.
Well, that's
Right.
exactly the thing. You're getting the conceptual parallel that seemed so compelling, right, between Arwen and Aragorn is really a parallel between the whole frame and one moment of the Baron and Luthien story,
Right.
not the whole trajectory of the Baron and
Right.
Luthien story.
Right.
Because we don't get there.
Yeah.
Right. The much later scene of the engagement of Arwen and Aragorn when they're
Yes.
betrothed, then we get the rest of that story. But we're pretty much told that she doesn't think very much of him at their first meeting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
She's
no,
like,
it
"Oh,
was
okay.
it was
So nice to meet you, kid.
it was fascinating. And I agree. Nick, I think it was. I'm fine with how things came out, but I agree that was challenging. That was challenging.
And another challenge with that one is it was the first frame where we had essentially 2 main characters to keep track of.
Right.
Because for every single other frame, there's been one point of view character and then, supporting cast.
Yeah.
And it's been very clear whose story it was all along.
Yes. Yes.
And this one, it was let's sometimes have it be Arwen's story and sometimes have it be Aragorn's story. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes they're both on screen together and sometimes they're not. And
Yes.
we're just going to interweave this whole entire thing. And that was a little ambitious for a frame.
Mhm.
And it was your request that we completely interweave it. And it was my objection that we could do exactly one episode interwoven. And then in the end, we did about half of them
Right.
interwoven.
Right.
So
yeah. No, it's.
And
It was-
there were definitely some really fun things about the frame. There are episodes that I felt the frame was very, very strong.
Yes.
One that stands out to me is the episode where Arwen goes to check in on Gilrain, who's sick, at the possibly intentional goading of Elrond,
Mhm.
and she's all upset with Aragorn for not being there. And then it turns out that he is in fact taking care of his mother rather than being out on adventures, which I'm sure he'd rather be doing.
Right.
And I felt like that particular episode, the frame was very strong, and it fit with the episode that it was a part of, but there is less about the season 6 frame that I look back on fondly, I think, than any other season, possibly with the exception of season 2.
It was
Corey, when you're like, oh, can't name a worst one because you never have a least favorite child, right? Except I think we've made it very clear which one is the least
apparently you guys don't have
season.
that same problem.
Well, I mean, it's not difficult for me at all.
Yep. No, so as we think towards season 7, there are a couple a couple things that I think are sort of good for us to think about. First of all, I'd like to start with a small version of where we started in session 1 of this season, thinking about scope, right? Where do we want to end? Now that we know we have 6 more seasons, right, in the first age, where do we want to end the first age? And because, of course, we're still then going to have second age to do after that, right? So, where do we want to, what do we want to get to? What are some of the major things that we definitely want to hit in the frame?
Or is the bigger question, where do we want to start the second age?
Sure. I mean, if the second age is going to end, well, where would we need the second age to end? Like, at some point, our times are going to collapse, right?
Right. Well, at some point, the frame narrative is going to have to move past. It's going to have to leapfrog over the Lord of the Rings, right? Because the Hobbit, it seems perfectly obvious that the Hobbit should be told by Bilbo in some context or other, right?
Yeah.
Like, that seems perfectly fine. And so older Bilbo, because it's the sort of story where we don't need to hide the ball that he's going to be okay, because we've already told the audience he's going to be fine, because we've seen him since the events of the Hobbit in the frame. The Lord of the Rings, because it's a more perilous story, I'd want to be a little bit more coy with who is telling the story.
Except it's got to be Sam.
Well, you could do something really interesting where you could have 3 older hobbits telling the different phases of the story, and then it turns out that it's Merry, Sam, and Pippin, and the 2 of them go to see Sam off at the Grey Havens. Like, that would be really interesting.
Right. So we could have an older gentleman hobbit who's just called grandpa by the little kids, or uncle or something,
or
and then
the
you
Thane
don't know.
and the
exactly. So then you don't know the name. Okay, so if you want to do coy that way, I'm fine with it.
Yeah.
But yes, I want to use Sam, Merry, and Pippin.
Right. Ultimately, the final season, right, which includes like the scouring of the Shire, and the last episode ends with "Well, I'm back," right?
Yes.
Then also the frame ends with Sam going to and getting on the boat, right?
Yes.
Right. So we'll do both Grey Haven scenes in the same episode.
Yeah.
And of course, once you get there, you'll know exactly what's happening.
You know exactly what's happening.
The second time. Yeah.
So basically, once we get the pivot point is going to be Bilbo's party. Basically, once in the frame we get up to Bilbo's party, like the frame approaches Bilbo's party. And then the main seasons are covering the Lord of the Rings stuff from Bilbo's party on. And then we get... and then at that point, we jump to a 4th age frame. Right?
Yes.
And we can do various 4th age frames. There are different things that we can definitely do there. Okay.
Well, we're going to be very Hobbit heavy by the time we get to the Hobbit Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Whereas we've been very Hobbit light here in the first stage.
Yes.
You think?
We did have Bilbo as a character.
We did have a Bilbo frame,
in a couple of them,
he's appeared twice, but he was the main character.
But I don't think we have a problem I don't think, because we decided a while ago that it's totally fine that the audience knows that Bilbo makes it through the Hobbit, because
Yeah.
that's the kind of story it is. It's perfectly
It's
reasonable,
not a spoiler issue. Yeah.
right, to
And
approach that
some of
story.
the dwarves are gonna die. It's fine.
Right,
Right.
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 You don't know what's gonna happen. Oh my gosh, when we saw the first Hobbit movie, my wife was like, "Oh, my favorite dwarves are Thorin and Philly and Killy." I was like, "Oh." That's
fine choices. Fine choices.
I see. She's like, why? What's gonna happen? See, but nothing at all.
Nothing at all. Yeah, exactly.
But yeah.
Okay,
So
so the Second Age, we don't. I mean, obviously, we haven't.
well,
mapped
there's
out the
Third
Second
Age stuff.
and Third
There's
Age
pre
stuff,
Lord
too.
of the Rings Third
Yeah.
Age stuff.
We will have to decide how much of that we're gonna.
Oh,
How?
sure.
I'm not
Yeah.
saying nothing, but like how much
Some,
of
but I
the
don't
Third
think
Age,
like 6 or 7 seasons of Third
No,
Age.
more
before we
like-
get there.
possibly one season to
Well,
get from the
yeah.
Fall of Sauron
I mean,
to
there's
the Hobbit.
there's the but there's the Fall of
Possibly.
There's the
Arnor
Arnor
stuff.
story. Yeah.
Yeah,
and-
yeah, but we could have done
and-
that in frame stories. Like I'm not.
Well, this is
Well,
an
it's too late.
option.